3 a.m., August 5th, 1962. Behind a locked bedroom door on 5th Helena Drive, Marilyn Monroe is already dead, and the one person awake in the house does not call the police. Eunice Murray sees a light burning under the door, knocks, gets nothing back, and picks up the phone to call a psychiatrist instead. Dr. Ralph Greenson is at the house within minutes. He breaks the bedroom window himself, climbs through, and finds the most famous woman in the world lying face down across the bed, one hand still curled around the cord of a telephone that never finished its call. Her own physician arrives next and confirms what Greenson already knows. Nobody dials the police for another 35 minutes. That gap is where this story actually starts. Here's the actual question this story answers. Nobody seriously disputes that Marilyn Monroe swallowed the drugs that killed her. What's never been settled is whether she was really alone when it counted, and whether the men who had spent the past year listening to her phone calls made sure that room told the story they needed it to tell, and not the one that actually happened inside it. To understand why anyone would think that, you have to go back 9 days to a lodge built directly on top of a state line, and a weekend Marilyn Monroe would later call a nightmare. The Cal-Neva Lodge sits on the California-Nevada border on purpose. Inside, a line is painted straight across the casino floor, marking the exact state boundary, so pit bosses can keep the gaming tables legally on the Nevada side by a matter of feet. On every license and every deed, the lodge belongs to Frank Sinatra. Behind the paperwork, it belongs just as much to Sam Giancana, boss of the Chicago outfit. Nevada's Gaming Control Board keeps an actual roster of men banned from any involvement with a licensed casino, a list everyone in the business calls the Black Book, and Giancana has been on it by name since 1960. His stake in Cal-Neva is not just a personal secret. It is a regulatory violation neither he nor Sinatra can afford to have proven, which is a large part of why nobody who was actually there that July weekend has ever been eager to fill in the details. Keep that name, Giancana, in mind, because before this story is over, his fingerprints turn up somewhere much closer to the truth than a party at a lake. A fixer named Skinny D'Amato runs the place day to day, while Giancana comes and goes through a private cabin that never makes it onto any guest list. On July 28th, Sinatra calls Marilyn Monroe personally and invites her up for the weekend, officially to celebrate a new movie deal. She flies in with her masseuse and finds Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Peter Lawford already there. Lawford being the actor who happens to be married to the president's sister, and who has spent 2 years as the unofficial bridge between Hollywood, the Rat Pack, and the White House. On paper, it is a party. By some accounts, she is so heavily medicated by the second night that someone has to physically get her back to her cabin. The movie deal is not small talk. 10 days earlier, 20th Century Fox had fired her outright from her own picture, Something's Got to Give, after she missed so many days of filming that the studio sent insurance investigators to photograph her, looking perfectly healthy beside her own swimming pool. By the time Sinatra calls with news of a fresh deal, her career is not a rumor she can afford to laugh off. It is the only thing standing between her and being finished in an industry that has already started drafting her obituary in the trade papers. Monroe will later tell her masseuse, Ralph Roberts, that it was a nightmare, a dreadful weekend. Skinny D'Amato, the one man who watched the whole thing happen, will only ever say this: there was more to what happened than anyone has told. Neither of them ever tells the rest of it. What survives is a set of photographs, the last ever taken of her alive, and months after she is dead, an FBI wiretap that happens to catch Giancana and his associate Johnny Rosselli discussing, almost in passing, a party at Cal-Neva that same weekend. The agents transcribing the call write down 2 words: sex party. They do not write down who else was in the room. She flies home a week before she dies. Whatever happened at that lodge, it is not, by itself, what kills her. But it tells you something this story needs you to know going in. By the summer of 1962, Marilyn Monroe is not just a movie star anymore. She is standing, whether she chose to or not, in the one place in America where the mob, the movie business, and the Kennedy family that all have to look at each other in the same room. Those rumors have a very public exhibit. 10 weeks before Cal-Neva, on May 19, 1962, Marilyn Monroe walks out in front of 15,000 people at Madison Square Garden, poured into a dress reportedly sewn onto her body, and sings Happy Birthday to President John F. Kennedy in a voice barely above a whisper, dragging out the word president for what feels like a full breath. The crowd laughs and cheers. The newspapers the next morning treat it as a wink between a movie star and a president who seems to have everything, a few column inches, and nothing more. Nobody watching that night, and almost nobody who has watched the footage since, needs it explained to them what the joke actually is. To understand why that mattered enough for people to end up dead, or at least to be blamed for it, you have to understand what Robert Kennedy is doing to Sam Giancana at exactly this moment. As Attorney General, Robert Kennedy has made Sam Giancana a personal target in a way no mob boss had ever been targeted before. FBI agents follow him into restaurants, book the tea time behind him at his own golf club, and park outside his house in 8-hour shifts, an operation so open and so relentless that it has no real precedent in bureau history. Giancana is furious about it, and not quietly. By 1963, the harassment is so constant that his own lawyers take the FBI to federal court over it, arguing the round-the-clock tailing has crossed from surveillance into outright intimidation. A district judge actually agrees and grants an injunction ordering agents back to a reasonable distance. It lasts only until a federal appeals court steps in and puts the ruling on hold. But for a few weeks in 1963, a sitting federal judge looks at what the Attorney General's own Justice Department is doing to one man and calls it excessive. That is how personal this fight has become. None of this is abstract to a man like Giancana. A Justice Department this aggressive can end careers, seize businesses, and put men away for decades on charges that used to be unwinnable. Compromising material on the president's own family is not entertainment to a boss under this kind of pressure. It is insurance, the one thing that might make an attorney general reconsider exactly how hard he wants to keep pushing. And to a man who has spent 30 years learning that everyone has a price or a secret, it does not go unnoticed. That the president, according to rumors already moving through Hollywood and Washington by 1962, has been involved with Marilyn Monroe for at least 2 years, ever since a party at Peter Lawford's beach house in Santa Monica first put them in the same room. That beach house becomes the president's off-the-record stop whenever he is in Los Angeles, close enough to the ocean and far enough from the press pool that almost nobody asks who comes and goes after dark. Sinatra earned that access the hard way, campaigning for Kennedy across the country in 1960 and delivering exactly the kind of star power a young senator from Massachusetts could never have bought outright, which is the whole strange arrangement in one sentence. The same singer fronting a mobster's hidden casino is also the man who opened the doors of Hollywood and Marilyn Monroe's phone number to a sitting president. In 1985, a private investigator named Fred Otosh tells a Los Angeles reporter that Lawford hired him directly, and that the job was to protect the Kennedys by making sure nothing incriminating about either brother ever left that beach house. By the early 1960s, Otosh has already wiretapped, followed, or dug up dirt on half of Hollywood's marriages and most of its scandals, working both sides of nearly every story he touches, hired by studios to protect their stars, and just as often hired by someone else to expose them. According to his own later account, protecting the beach house means wiring it and listening. A book published decades after Otosh's death, built from notes and tapes he left behind, goes one step further. It claims Otosh also had a line running into Marilyn Monroe's own house on 5th Helena Drive, and that on the night she died, that line was live. His notes, according to the book, describe what he heard that night as a violent argument between Monroe and Robert Kennedy. No recording has ever surfaced publicly to confirm any of it, and Otosh's own account of what he heard, and for whom he was really working, changed more than once across the years he told the story. Skeptics have never let that go. But the claim has outlived the man who made it for a simple reason. It is the only version of that night that explains both the missing 35 minutes and why the people inside that house might have needed them. If this is the kind of story you come to this channel for, this is a good moment to hit subscribe, because what the physical evidence actually shows next is stranger than either side of this argument wants it to be. The autopsy is performed the next day by by Dr. Thomas Noguchi, a deputy medical examiner 4 years into the job. He finds a lethal dose of 2 drugs in Monroe's blood, enough Nembutal and chloral hydrate together to kill her several times over. He also finds something that should not be there if she swallowed pill after pill from the bottles scattered by her bed. Nothing. Her stomach is almost empty. No capsules. No dye. None of the residue a fatal oral dose of that size should leave behind. Noguchi spends the next several decades defending his own ruling. A habitual pill user, he says, can metabolize a dose fast enough to leave the stomach clean, and there is nothing scientifically impossible about that explanation. But in the same breath, on the record, he also admits something else. An empty stomach is exactly what you would expect to find if the drugs never went in through her mouth at all. Then there is the room itself. Pills scattered across the nightstand. Bottles arranged neatly enough that every label faces out, as if for a photograph. And no glass. Not on the nightstand, not on the floor, not even in the bathroom sink. Nothing a woman could have used to swallow enough barbiturates to kill her 3 times over. Sergeant Jack Clemens, the first police officer to walk into that bedroom, will spend the rest of his life telling the same story to anyone who asks. The scene looked staged. The sheets looked too clean for a woman who had supposedly been thrashing through a fatal overdose. Nothing in that room matched the official version of how she died. The one witness who could explain the timeline never tells it the same way twice. In her first statements, right after it happens, Eunice Murray says she noticed something wrong around midnight. Later, she moves that to 3:30, closer to the version that matches Greenson's own account. Decades later, in an interview filmed for a documentary long after almost everyone else in this story is dead, she is asked directly whether Robert Kennedy came to the house that night. She hesitates, starts to say more than she has ever said before, and then stops herself mid-sentence and changes the subject. She never finishes that thought on camera, and she never gets another chance to. She dies in 1994 without ever giving one final, consistent account of her own night. Peter Lawford is the last person ever confirmed to speak to her alive. He calls to invite her to a dinner party, and by his own account, her words are already slurring badly enough to frighten him. The call ends, by his telling, with her saying goodbye to him, to his wife, and, he later claims, to the president, before the line goes dead. Worried, Lawford calls Monroe's house to ask Murray to check on her, then calls his own lawyer, Mickey Rudin, for advice. Rudin's advice is to stay away from the house entirely, to avoid the kind of story that breaks if a married movie star is found intoxicated at the home of a Kennedy in-law. So Lawford stays home. According to Otosh's own later account, it is Lawford who calls him the following day, not that night, with a different kind of request. Get to the house and make sure nothing incriminating is still sitting out. Emptied bottles, laundered sheets, a room arranged for whoever walks in next. It is, if true, the single explanation that connects every piece of physical evidence in this story. The missing glass, the 2 clean bedding, the labels all turned outward as if for inspection, and the 35 minutes nobody can fully account for. None of this proves murder. What it proves is that the clean, one-line version of that night, pills, alone, her own hand, was never as clean as the headlines the next morning made it sound. And the men who had spent the past year listening to her telephone are the same men every biography written since has pointed to as having the most to lose if whatever she knew ever reached a grand jury. So what did she actually know? Nobody has ever produced a diary page, a document, or a recording that survives to answer that with certainty. The theories fill in that blank with everything from love letters to a diary she was supposedly keeping in her final months, its pages never recovered, to nothing more than the plain fact of who she had been sleeping with and when. Whatever it was, or wasn't, the men around her in that final summer all had reasons of their own to make sure it went into the ground with her. Robert Kennedy's own alibi for that weekend, on paper, is airtight. Flight records and eyewitnesses place him 300 miles north of Los Angeles, at a ranch outside Gilroy, from Friday afternoon straight through Monday morning, out on a horseback ride Saturday, at Mass in town Sunday, 5 hours by car from the house on 5th Helena Drive, and further still from a story that needed him anywhere near it. Years later, 2 former Los Angeles police chiefs, Daryl Gates and Tom Redden, say publicly that informants had placed Kennedy at a hotel in Beverly Hills that same day, sightings that were never confirmed at the time, never officially investigated, and never fully explained away either. Both versions of Robert Kennedy's Saturday are still standing today, side by side, and in 60 years, nobody has managed to knock either one down for good. 20 years after her death, as new claims kept surfacing in books and on television, the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office finally agreed to look at the case one more time, not as a full homicide investigation, but as what prosecutors called a threshold inquiry, a check to see whether a real investigation was even justified. An investigator named Ronald Carroll spent 3.5 months on it. Witness statements, medical records, phone logs, the original coroner's file, all of it pulled and reread 20 years late. His conclusion, when it finally came, was almost as unsatisfying as the case itself. No credible evidence of murder. But buried in his own report is an admission that parts of the original 1962 investigation simply were not done properly the first time, records left incomplete, questions nobody wearing a badge had thought to ask while the trail was still warm. Which means the honest answer to did anyone kill Marilyn Monroe has never actually been no. For 60 years, it has only ever been we cannot prove yes, and those are not the same sentence, even if only one of them made it onto the death certificate. So here, finally, is where that locked door and those 35 minutes actually leave us. Marilyn Monroe did take the drugs that killed her. On that much, every serious examination for 6 decades agrees, and nothing in this story changes it. What nobody has ever closed the file on is whether she took them entirely alone, in a room nobody outside was watching. In a summer when a mob boss owned a hidden stake in the last vacation of her life, a private investigator claims to have owned a live wire into her bedroom, and the Attorney General of the United States owned an open, personal war against the men who ran both. The coroner's own report says probable suicide. He did not write certain. After 60 years, nobody else has been able to write it either. Nobody who actually loved her waited for a coroner's report to reach a verdict. Days later, at a small funeral organized entirely by her first husband, Joe DiMaggio draws up the guest list himself, and it does not include Frank Sinatra, Peter Lawford, or a single name attached to the White House. When studio executives push back and ask him to soften the list, DiMaggio's answer is the shortest, hardest line in this entire story. Tell them, if it wasn't for them, she'd still be here. He never sues anyone. He never goes on television to make his case. He just closes the door, the same way somebody closed hers 9 days after Cal-Neva, and he never opens it again for any of them. And that is the real cost of the kind of power Sam Giancana spent his life building. The secrecy that let him own a casino nobody could trace to him, and buy his way into a president's inner circle through his own sister-in-law's living room, is the exact same secrecy that means nobody will ever be able to prove he had nothing to do with what happened on 5th Helena Drive. He built a life so hidden that even his innocence, if he had any left to claim, can never be verified. The hiding worked so well, it became its own life sentence. The exact skill that let him sit invisibly at the center of American power is the same skill that leaves him permanently, unfalsifiably suspected of a death he may have had nothing to do with at all. Giancana never spoke publicly about what his people had on the Kennedys, or on her. He carried that silence for 13 more years, until a Senate committee investigating the CIA's own dealings with the mob finally started asking him, formally, to explain it under oath. He never got the chance